In recent talks, I've spoken about jobs, roles, and the difference between jobs and roles. And I'm going to talk a lot about roles in a future talk, but right here, I want to examine a topic that is also related to mind and what mind is and can be, and how that gets interfered with in our culture, even by, and sometimes especially by, subcultures and ideas that claim to champion or consciousness or enlightenment or wisdom or understanding. In fact, these are the most obvious places that we find parasites, swarming parasites actually, hungry to swallow up anyone looking for an answer, because there's a simple reason. In the domains of wisdom, insight, understanding, clarity of vision, enlightenment, you have to go past your first move has to be past your dependence on others. And until you make that move, you're not going to have much luck with anything. And that move probably isn't going to succeed immediately either, so you're going to have to keep trying it even though it fails, which can be very, very disillusioning, disorienting. What I want to talk about is this. I want to talk about the fact that we kind of are supposed to have ordinarily at least two births, and I actually think that we're supposed to have a major birth and then a second birth, and then, but it's confusing because there's life phases in there between the first birth and the second one, and maybe even after that one. in the sense that in the praying mantis, which is a very amazing, ancient, and extremely intelligent small creature, an insect, they go through 7 instars, and their instars are encounters with death. They are crossing the bridge of death at each of these sort of gaps between their life phases, and there are 7 of them, and they start out about maybe, I don't know, 3 millimeters, 4 millimeters in size. Very, very tiny little creatures. And by the time they're done, they may be between 1 inch and 4 inches long. And with each life phase, they gain incredible new abilities, and they grow very dramatically. You might ask yourself, well, what does this have to do with what I'm talking about? Well, we do something like that inside. But our cultures don't know that, or if they do, they are co-opting and hiding it. And we don't really have any good traditions to help us understand the process, or what its opportunities and dangers are, or what happens when it's inhibited or silenced, or what happens when it gets disconnected from nature, which is its natural regulating principle. In other words, in the same way that clocks regulate our lives, nature regulates our growth processes, our development, and in fact our health. And the relationship is deeply intimate. It's similar to a fish being in water. The difference is that we don't understand when we are taken out of this water and begin to die because we've been taken out. Because we cannot see the parts of ourselves that begin to die that way. They happen to be the parts we see with. So here's the problem. When we remove ourselves from nature and from the intimate and constant connectivity with it, especially because of our culture, and especially because we live in culture that values science or religion, both of which actually directly interfere with nature in most cases, if not all of them. Since nature is so profound that making religion about it is kind of a mistake, even that's not going to help us, in fact, and will usually stand in the way. We get certain kinds of assets with each birth. We're born first from our mothers. We're conceived in the womb, and we undergo a 9-month gestation period. I want to talk a little bit about that. We probably go through instars there also, and they might even be similar to the ones we may go through outside the womb, but the ones that will happen outside the womb will be different in a variety of ways. They will include other dimensions of growth besides the physical. I think the ones in the womb do as well, but it's really difficult for us to get any handle on that since we can't talk to fetuses. Well, maybe we can, but not in ways that are ordinary or easily verified. Let's put it that way. So I think we undergo 7 instars in the womb, at least, and I'm just going to use the number 7. I'm not sure that's the correct number, but it's the correct number for praying mantises, and it seems a good one for us. So something really strange happens in the womb, which is that, some of us have heard this idea that, which is often phrased in complex language, ontology recapitulates phylogeny. And what that means is it's an idea that the shapes that the fetus goes through in the womb represent our evolutionary history being played back. And I'm not sure what the scientific status of this idea is. It may have been completely disproven. I think I read something somewhere that it was pretty close to being disproven. But even if it has been disproven, there is something profound going on in the womb, and there's ways to talk about it. Time inside the womb, separated from all other forces and culture by the membrane of the mother's body, as the child is developing from basically 2 cells into billions of cells and brains and organs and things. There is a very profound process playing out there, and I think actually that what happens in that 9 months in the womb is temporally equivalent to the entire history of Earth. In other words, there's important ways to understand how 9 months can, in some circumstances, be 4.5 billion years or 3 billion years. So I think we undergo the temporal developmental phase that is equivalent to the life form that we are, to basically the entire history of life on Earth inside the womb. And then we are ready to be born as a physical creature outside the womb and become a participant in the next living iteration of that process and become the agent and body of that process. And of course we are born, and we begin here in human culture to then establish knowledge authorities, who we trust to tell us what things, beings, and circumstances are and are about, and we establish bases of meaning. What are the most important, meaningful roots in this world and in our lives? These also happen in language. We establish knowledge authorities in language, and we also establish bases of meaning in language. Now we sort of bring with us a preternatural intelligence that is as old as that experience in the womb. It is capable of the most astonishing things, and it comes prepared to develop into kinds of beings we have never seen because we will not allow them to be born or to develop. And what I mean by that is that the infant human being is uniquely endowed to become anything, to learn any language, to join any culture, including an animal culture, any culture at all that it may land in. It is amazingly endowed for this one thing, to just become a member. And unfortunately, in our time, we don't have anything worthy of it. Listen to that silence for a minute. Our children are born into cultures unworthy of their assets and their minds. And I don't mean slightly unworthy. I mean these cultures will assassinate them and rape them and completely destroy them. And you think I'm being hyperbolic. I'm not being hyperbolic enough. I'm being very conservative. The assets that a human child brings are unthinkable. You've got something with the capacity to be almost as intelligent as a world of living beings in one spot. And we amputate its assets one by one, co-op, and then when the child is suffering sufficiently from that, we begin selling them parasitic replicas that don't function but produce a little spark because they remind them of what's been amputated in the culture. If they were met with prodigy and wonder, if they were met with intelligence, deep and abiding, they would transcend that. But instead they are met with hate, confusion, religion, mediocrity, forms of knowledge that are as oppressive and dangerous as they are liberating, yet we are not endowed with sufficient understanding of their dangers to manipulate them. They are endowed with languages that dictate the world they shall discover, and even the religions which we position as exits and ladders that lead us up out of culture are exactly the same thing. They're mimics and parasites, mostly, dressed up to lead us away from something fundamental, so fundamental that we can't be taught about it by other human beings. No one knows is the right answer. And the reason that no one knows, we can play and speak about it, but we can't be taught and no one should tell us what we should expect to find outside of human culture, in the afterlife, in the before life, what reincarnation is. We can talk about these things playfully, but when we begin to tell people what to expect of the extracultural experience of themselves and their soul, and their mind and their consciousness, we're lying. And when we're doing a very dangerous thing, we're stealing something that should be preserved and respected, which is each person's incredibly unique and inviolable right and responsibility, if not obligation, to discover that. And our obligation to assist them in all ways that we can, both within and outside of human culture, in nature. So we're born into human culture, we get knowledge authorities. These partially are in language and partially are in people, like mom and dad, science, religion, famous people who become famous in our minds because we look up to them, role models. This is a really scary game because we're being tricked. And we're also being trained to worship rather than become, and even to gain social rewards by trading tokens about who we worship. Again, instead of becoming. Again, instead of being original, developing our own assets, surpassing our mentors and our role models, which is in fact their demand, their mandate. But we've got something else in mind, and that is adulation, not much emulation, and a lot of sort of commerce, social commerce over which subcultures we have badges of belonging for. And these include religious cultures, which are supposed to lead us outside of cultures, and enlightenment cultures, and commercial cultures, and science cultures. And neither science or religion is in any way sufficient to tell us much about what's outside of human culture, or what's inside our nature. Science is ill-equipped, but wants to talk about everything as though it's an expert, which is silly. Science has a very narrow field of applicable expertise. It doesn't understand living things. In fact, it tortures them all day long to learn about them. So I think that's pretty clear. That it just as a way of knowing, science has yet to demonstrate any kind of reasonable understanding of living beings, except kind of as machines and chemical processes and things. And religion similarly has utterly and catastrophically failed to lift us out of all that it seems to want to warn us against, and in fact, strangely and ironically, tends to bury us further in it, in almost every case, with very few exceptions. Even though, again, as toys, these are valuable. We shouldn't dismiss them. We can't get rid of language or science or religion. We wouldn't want to. But we would like to better understand their useful scope and the threats and dangers they present, and also how to better make use of the real opportunities they present, which currently we do not. Most of what's going on now is we're being used by our tools to reproduce the worst and often most egregious results of them. as our cultures, and then we're teaching our children are watching and being subject to this. The planet is dying of it. So theoretically, there's supposed to be kind of a second big birth, but even before that, we go through what I'll call instars or life phases, and these are kind of obvious. Even if we just look at childhood, there's some pretty significant phase changes throughout childhood. And we might even imagine that there are epicycles, so that there's like bubbles of 7 within one. So the first phase would be comprised of 7 epiphases that recapitulate those that were undergone in the womb and those that will be undergone in life. I know that sounds really complex. We could keep it just at 7, but if you really look closely, you'll see there are repetitive epicycles that echo the developmental phases, even within each phase. And so it's as if maybe between 1 and 7 they go through all 7 cycles, yeah? But it's really just kind of one cycle in the bigger life picture. That's kind of what I'm saying. Again, I'm just talking about toys here. I'm not saying this is reality. I'm saying this is a way we should think. At the edge of each life phase, there is often a crisis. Sometimes a really significant one. It can be emotional, perceptual, relational, physical. And it may feel like it could be death, right? Like this might destroy us. And this is part of our growth process. I call it, at least in this talk, I'm going to call it crossing the death bridge. Now, for the praying mantis, this is a very real and deadly experience, because what's going to happen is it has its skeleton on the outside, and its skeleton is flexible in a certain way until one day it starts to stiffen. And then the mantis must very quickly find exactly the precise location in physical space to cross the death bridge, because what's going to happen next is it's going to be frozen solid, paralyzed, effectively buried alive in its own skeleton for about 36 hours, maybe a little less, maybe 12 to 16, yeah. And if everything goes right, it's going to tear out of that skeleton from within in a new body with new powers. And in one of those instars, they get wings. So they go from being a land animal that they've been for 5 instars, I think, to suddenly on the 6th that they can fly. Think about that. But during those 17 hours, which for the mantis is probably equivalent to about 3 months, or a long, long time, given the mantis's lifespan of maybe 8 months. So in an 8-month lifespan, 16 hours could be a very long time. I can't do the math off the top of my head. For a small creature who lives in that span, that time is a different amount. And the mantis is frozen solid, and it's a delicious little treat that lots of stuff would love to eat, and everything's looking for it, and they can smell it, right? So it gives off a scent of food. So it's frozen in plain sight, and it's a nice, munchy, crunchy little bit that everybody would like to. It's basically like a shrimp. It's a land shrimp. Anything would like a piece of that. And so it's really in a dangerous spot. It's frozen in place. It can't do anything. And then it's going to have a real crisis breaking out of that skeleton, which is its own body. Think about it. Its own vehicle is what it must break out of. We must do the same within. Now, we ordinarily do this for our regular growth phases, but it's as if there's something that without cultural support cannot fully be expressed, and may even be completely inhibited, such that we don't get to know or celebrate our life phases at all. And because we're not doing this, we're not likely to emerge from the second egg of culture, which requires some help from other people, or at least the knowledge and necessity of doing this, of attempting it, of breaking that second shell that we're born into, that we grow inside, until we're ready to emerge into adulthood, what we call adulthood, but really what we mean is a much more mature phase, which is still very playful and childlike and contains its child, but has deeper seeing and clearer seeing and new powers of intimacy and sensing and intelligence, all different kinds. So we need to break out of that shell, and what will help us? Worse, we start to realize we're going to have to break out around the time we are teenagers, most of us. And instead of there being any support for that process, it's the opposite. So what we end up doing instead is drugs, crime, sexual adventure, physical adventure, thrill-seeking, and fame-seeking and stuff like that. Not all of the things that we do are bad, although a lot of the things I listed I think are pretty negative. But many of them are attempts to demonstrate that we recognize that we're reaching the phase we're supposed to break out of culture, and there are no traditions, there are no knowledge ways, no traditions, no ceremonies, no wise men or women, no leaders, no mentors to help us. And even in the places where we would expect them, the self-help authors, the enlightenment authors, the metaphysical authors, I've been all through that stuff, and there's not much help there either, believe it or not. In fact, there's a lot of really confusing stuff that won't really help us much unless we go for ourselves and look in person first. And our cultures are not only are they not going to encourage that, they're going to inhibit it. And not only are they going to inhibit it, what's going to probably happen, because these processes have been getting shut down and lied about throughout our lives, is we're going to have a broken emergence event. And what do I mean by that? Now let me explain what I mean. As we know, in the womb, development can go wrong due to insult, of various kinds of insult. Sometimes it's merely a problem with genetic inheritance, but other times there's unknown problems that produce developmental misfire. The results can be tragic, but the same thing happens with the development of our minds, our consciousness, what I will call our souls in our lives. And this is the result, usually, often, of various kinds of insults, things that are missing, things that are misformed. Excuse me. So, once we're born, during our developmental phases, if we experience inhibited or damaged emergence events, what may happen is that assets that would normally be developmental aids in our growth can become either broken, amputated, hidden, sublimated, or they can transform into something that we attack ourselves with. They can, in other words, become autotoxic. And this is very common. For most of us will have something like this. This is why we have psychologists, in a sense. We will have developmental assets that went rogue, so to speak, during our development, because our emergences were inhibited. Now, in some cases, we get extreme examples. We get people with severe compulsions, profound mental difference, shall we say? Things that are ordinarily spoken about as psychosis, sociopathy, schizophrenia, other disorders like eating disorders and self-harming disorders, other disorders of social and personal narrative where the basic relational space has become so dangerously confused, chaotic, or falsified that the person can't exist in any, or can't continue to develop at all. In other words, sometimes one of the assets that's broken is fundamental, and sometimes it's peripheral. Sometimes both. But with our damaged emergence events, we get inhibited or broken developmental assets. And more than likely what would happen is the opposite. We would get refined, reforged developmental assets if these life phase processes were supported, and particularly if the major leap out of culture were supported. And I'm going to talk about that briefly now. In terms of roles, which I've spoken of previously, and how we might acquire real roles for ourselves rather than those that culture projects onto us, which I think are generally insufficient. We need the kind that are natural to our soul, not those that come from human culture. Not that we can't play with those in human culture, but fundamentally we have to break that shell eventually and go outside of it. We can help each other to do it too. But the process has to be done alone. And so what I'm talking about here is really, it's something we've heard about before under different guises. The idea of enlightenment is part of this. And the reason it's not something you can get, well, there's lots of ways to talk about why it can't be gotten. It's not a thing or a noun. It's a way of being forward into yourself or something like that. So you can't get it. You can't get away. In the same way you can't get a kiss. You can give one, you can receive one, but you can't take one with you. You can be the kissing. It's sort of like that. You can be the enlightenment-ing yourself, and then something like that might be reasonable to talk about, although the word itself is confused. What we sort of want is better clarity of vision, so growing clarity of emotional understanding of deep embodied understanding as the root of understanding, and awareness and consciousness without any real definitions of these. And then lastly, but not necessarily firstly, intelligence, intellect also is one of the faculties. And all of these have astonishing faculties associated with them, all of which are inhibited and co-opted by our cultures. Even our art forms often co-opt and inhibit them. Though I love art and I believe in it as a force for rescuing these, actually. When we have a successful life phase change, when we cross the bridge of death successfully, even in the small, in the minuscule, so to speak, in the little phases, there's a dramatic, powerful surge of new ability and insight and power, as we may be able to remember from some part of our childhood where we knew we'd passed a road mark that brought us into a whole new world of opportunity to learn what we might be, who we might be, how we might become. And the second birth is the most explosive version of this. Oh, there, I gave it away. So one of the guises we've heard this idea under is in the Bible, in Christianity, whether or not we care to talk about anything like that. There's something we're all fairly probably familiar with, whether we're Christians or not, which is this idea of a second birth. And Christ apparently says something like, or one of Christ's representatives says something like, unless you are born again, you will not see the kingdom of heaven, or something like this. And I'm not going to try to verify or refute Christianity or even theism. I'm only talking about the idea that there might be something to this statement, whether or not there's anything to any of those other ideas. That there might be something to the idea that we have to undergo this second birth. And it's terrifying. Probably going to be very scary. We might have a really easy one. I think some human babies have a very easy birth. Possibly. I haven't been able to talk to them about that. But I think most of them have a crisis, crossing a bridge of death. In fact, just trying to think about fitting a whole body through the vaginal opening, I think you and me both would realize, especially if we haven't been instructed that that's what's about to happen. We were suddenly thrust into the process. We'd probably be fairly concerned about that. I think there'd be some worry involved unless we were a really smooth sailor, so to speak. So here's the interesting thing. Most of us we're not going to get to have the second birth. Our culture is going to inhibit it so fiercely, or co-opt it so fiercely, meaning they'll represent it to us and sell us like a replacement that looks like it. We think we've had it, and we didn't. Because we got it from inside culture, so it's part of the shell. Right? We have to go outside the shell. A lot of us aren't going to experience it. Some of us may partially experience it due to crisis or sudden luck or persistence. Even skill. Although mostly I think it's more than things like persistence and luck. It's hard to try to do it, and it's pretty hard to how shall I put this? There are many elements of this process that, if they are not a surprise, it's not the process. In other words, if someone predicts them to you, and those predictions come true, something's kind of wrong. And even what I'm saying here is a little bit dangerous for that reason, but I'm warning you about that. And I'm also being very clear that I'm speaking semi-figuratively. I'm asking you to think about things in the way I'm talking about them rather than to believe everything I'm saying. So I'm not asking you to develop a religion with me, I'm just asking you to explore these ideas for yourself and see if they have any value. So what triggers the second birth often is accident. And the accident often involves the belief that one is about to die. And so many of the situations in the past where cultures knew about this and they preserved ways to ensure that the life phases were protected and were supported, and particularly this leap out of the culture into superculture, into nature, was not only supported but was an obligation of each adult in the community. In fact, really each teen, or maybe even a child, because it would happen sometime around the teen time. And by the way, since that doesn't happen in our culture, guess what happens instead? Every kind of nightmare you can imagine, because in their souls they know they are made to leap off the cliff and fly right now. And instead of inviting that, we're shutting it down. And we want them to get jobs, which means they're never going to have roles. They're never going to become, they're never even going to be able to discover what they came here for, who they are, what the meaning of our journey here is about, without it being stipulated. They're never going to have these chances except through the shell of human culture, which, frankly, while beautiful and somewhat rich, is not deep enough. It's not habitable. Especially in our time, it's incredibly abstract and a lot oriented around data, images, representations, and tokens, manipulables, which are not habitable. We don't understand that we get young women who, for example, are afraid to appear as more than stick figures because they realize that the most attractive thing is the manipulable leftover, the skeleton. And so little girls stop eating. This is the nature of, these are the signals that are present in our culture that we ignore. We're not even seeing them. We think there's something wrong with the little girls. We're boldly mistaken. Almost all of what our children do and what our adults do are signals about what's going on in our culture in that shell that we're ignoring. We're supposed to trace those signals back to their sources and resolve them there, not punish the people who signal. Since we don't do that, the sources in the culture regenerate and advance and produce ever more serious signals, ever more profound inhibitions of our life phases, amputations of the assets that our human birth brings to the world and to us. And this tragedy just gets deeper and deeper, and it's crucifying nature in the process. Yes, I'm using Christian metaphors, but crucifixion is not solely Christian, by the way. No, we're destroying nature in the process because the kind of intelligence we're producing is soulless. I don't mean soulless as in a-religious. I mean soulless as in not habitable by living beings of any kind. It's not a religious idea, the soul. The soul means to continue living beyond words and numbers, abstractions and systems of thought, paradigms, and the traps that they comprise when they escape their appropriate contexts. So the second birth would ordinarily happen with nature, from culture into nature, which is the superculture that our human cultures are a strange and often toxic shadow of, especially in modern times. They haven't always been. I don't think, but they certainly are in modern times, worldwide, with very, very, very few exceptions. So that means that we not only are failing to establish cultures that are healthy for ourselves, we're failing to establish human cultures nature can survive encountering. And now that there are over 7 billion of us, that means that nature's lifespan, as we understand her, has become exceptionally limited unless we can transform our intelligence back to something survivable both for us and what we emerge as an expression of, what our minds emerge as an expression of, what our souls emerge as an expression of. So that is nature, right outside of culture, and we think we know what she is, and boy are we confused, because if you get a taste, if you get just a clue, it's going to crack the shell of human culture so severely that the crack will not resolve. And you're going to see, even in the implication of this little crack, that everything you believe about humans and nature is wrong. In a fundamental way. A fundamental way that's more important than all of science. More important than all of religion. More important than all of philosophy. And that way is you. There's no way to explain this, and you have to have the experience of it. And the way isn't just you, the way is the way of you and nature as a unity, as mother, child, father, brother, sister, daughter, grandfather, grandson, granddaughter, grandmother, animal, tree. The way of nature is you. And what will happen during the second birth is you will be introduced to the authorities that are the sources of our religions and our sciences, and they are not human. I don't know what they are. No one knows what they are. But they're trustworthy. We may not be, but these authorities in nature are trustworthy, and they were the ancient companions of our development and intelligence, and they were the guarantors of our life phases. Divorced from them, we are bereft of ourselves. And nature must exist in all her splendor for us not to be divorced from them. For if we assassinate her even slightly, the universes inside us die in proportion, or maybe even in geometric proportion. Because in some way we are a magnification lens for all of the relation that happens in nature. It is magnified inside us in a dimension we have no name for, but is part of our souls. And when I speak here of the second birth, I speak of direct encounter with these things. Now, each time we dream, we're getting close. We're in the neighborhood. But there's a way to have experiences while you are awake. That's not what I mean. Let me restate that. There's a process, a terrifying process. It is like falling. And we have some representations of it in story. Alice in Wonderland is a significant one that comes easily to mind. This is a parable that can be understood as a map of one person's of the visionary element, the transmissible vision of the element of their experience. Yeah, not the experience itself, but the sort of signature of it. Yeah, that's what it would be. Now, two people that have undergone this will recognize each other instantly, and they will also recognize anyone who's pretending. It's just like if you've been to a river and tasted the water and know a certain place on the river that anyone who's seen this river would know. And then you meet someone else and they say, yeah, I've been to that river, I've tasted that water, and you ask them about the flavor and they tell you something that can't be true. So then you ask them about that specific tree or that specific feature, or whether the river contains a certain fish that you know to be there, and you might even put false information in there, and you can immediately tell. Each person, each man or woman, each child will know. Now here's the other strange thing. Little children know what I'm talking about. They're undergoing it quickly, fast, because they're going through life change phases very quickly, and they're growing at an incredible rate. So they know the pieces of what I'm talking about, and young children know that the human cultural shell is toxic and that the adults are badly confused, and they're afraid to become adults because of this. We all spoke of this when I was little, and perhaps you did as well. If you didn't, you knew it anyway. Everything I've spoken of here is known. Nothing here is me. This is all knowledge inside us, a silent knowledge that we all carry. It's very hard to learn to say, or find within us and speak it. It's difficult to explain how you can choose the path, the process of the second birth that leads you into an understanding of your real history, your real identity. It leads you into contact with true knowledge authorities that will contradict those in human culture dramatically, all of them. But it may build on some of them, and it will demand shocking things of you that are very confusing. For example, you will have to resist the urge to codify everything you discover and then tell it. Because you'll have to resist the urge to make a system out of it, a religion, a part of culture, right? If you make it a part of culture, you've killed it and frozen it, you've lost it. In a sense. There may be exceptions. The process is fraught with dangers and opportunities. It can kill you. It can destroy your mind. You will encounter such terror and beauty as you are not prepared to understand in your wildest hopes. There's no way to prepare you, and you shouldn't be prepared, because part of the process is the demand that you decide for yourself what to do, how to respond, and that you make your own choices, and these things are not pre-described or predefined to you, that you are free to discover in your own way, because what you're carrying is that unique. It's similar in many ways, but it's as unique as it is similar. So we have to be very careful not to frame it to each other or listen to what religions tell us. They're lying. They should not be telling us that. They have no authority to do that. Only direct contact with the sources of storying has authority. Only direct contact with that which can teach you what time is about, what light is about, what a tree is, what the sun is, what a planet means, what an animal is. Not in a way that uses definitions, in a way that introduces you to a sense of these things that grows so shockingly that every time you touch it, it is as if you are flying in the dimension of learning. There is so much more to say, but I think I've said enough for now, enough to digest. I hope you found something intriguing here, and I want you to understand that we all deserve to have the life phases supported and not made into religions and not made into science, left natural, and that we all deserve to have the second birth out of human culture back into nature and into an understanding of the deeper aspects of our humanity, without which we cannot become mature or even intelligent. It's not possible. Our cultures cannot become mature or intelligent because they will not know what the sun is, or a tree, or an animal. And if we have really, really bad ideas about this, they basically inhibit our ability to become or hope for intelligence. And we get something that looks vaguely like it, but functions like its opposite, which is most of what we've got. There will be a lot more coming in future lectures. Feel free to share this one with anyone you think might enjoy it. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to learning together. Goodbye for now.